This is BBC Radio 4. Now, at 9:05, it's time for this morning's edition of Election Call. It's introduced, as usual, by Jonathan Dimbleby.
Good morning and welcome to Election Call, the very last of this campaign before tomorrow you make your choice about which party should become the next British government. Today it's your election call to the leader of the Conservative Party, John Major, who would like you to take his advice and return him to Downing Street tomorrow as Prime Minister. The lines are still open. The number to ring 071 799 5000. And our first caller is on the line, Syed Shah, ringing from Peterborough. It's your election call to Mr. Major.
Good morning, Mr. John Major.
Good morning, Mr. Shah.
Yeah, my question is, if it is true that this recession in Britain is due to world recession and not due to the Tories' policy, then it is equally true that the prosperity of the Tory years was due to world prosperity and not due to the Tories' policy. If you don't take the blame for the recession, then you can't have the credit for the prosperity.
Well, I don't entirely disagree with that proposition. One of the undeniable realities of modern-day economics and modern-day politics is that we are a very interdependent world economically. Each country is affected either adversely or favourably by what happens across the world. The most practical illustration of that, of course, is what happens to one's exports. If countries abroad are booming and they're buying a lot and spending a lot, they will, of course, attract more exports from this country. There's a greater possibility to export. So that is certainly true. It's equally true when there are difficulties, that if other countries abroad are in difficulty, if their economies are slowing down, then they're going to have less demand for the sort of goods that we sell. The best illustration of that in recent months, of course, has been the defence industry, where countries around the world, for different reasons, have cut back on their defence expenditure, and that has had its impact upon our defence industry, which is one of the greatest suppliers in the world.
Mr. Shah?
So there is certainly a shred of truth in what you say, and I don't disagree with it.
Mr. Shah, the Prime Minister does not entirely disagree with what you say.
So it's true then that you can't get the credit for the prosperity.
He said he couldn't take all the credit for the prosperity.
No, I can't take all of it. I think that's absolutely true. I think one can neither, not just this government, I think any government can neither take all the credit for what happens or all the blame, I think. Of course, governments can get things wrong and wreck the prospect of taking advantage of favourable conditions. That is equally true. But I think your fundamental point is correct. We are to a degree dependent upon what happens across the world and the state of markets across the world.
Sorry? And then it's equally true that the blame you put on Labour, it was due to the world recession, not due to the Labour policy.
In the 74 to 79 period. Yes. Well, I don't think that is quite so true, because there wasn't at that stage the international conditions that have applied at the moment. What actually happened between 1974 to 79 was largely domestically caused.
Prime Minister, did not the oil prices rise 4 times?
I was going to come particularly to the oil price. And that's certainly true, and we are, of course, an oil producer. But there was no other major industrial country at that stage that had the International Monetary Fund coming in to correct our position, which is what happened with the Labour government, and then they continued as a Lab government under the tutelage of the IMF. They actually created, though I refer to this only because you raised the matter, they actually created a position where we both had a recession and 27% inflation, and that knocked on for some time after 1979, of course.
Mr. Shah, thank you very much. And now Francis Bull from Dagenham, your election call to John Major.
Overall taxation, according to the Inland Revenue Staff Federation, has increased by 2% over the past 13 years. So whilst the already well-filled coffers of the richest have been stuffed with even more shekels, the increase in taxes has fallen on the poorer in the community. To increase the topsy-turviness of the situation, the richest saved hundreds, even thousands a year each on the introduction of the poll tax and the proposed council tax. How can you expect the electorate to accept you as a bona fide candidate for a fair administration of a classless society for the future?
Well, let me pick up the various points that you make. The figures I think that the Inland Revenue Staff Association are quoting are 78 to 79 and 91 to 92. I would suggest a fairer reflection of the overall tax burden was 79 to 80, the first year in which the Tories set the tax structure, and 92 to 93, which is the year we have just set the tax structure for. On that basis, the tax burden, that is income tax, VAT, local taxes, everything together, has risen by 0.25% over the 13 years. That is true. Part of the reason for that, of course, is that the tax burden reflects the burden on companies, and companies that were not making a profit and now are, pay tax and therefore increase the tax burden. Can I turn directly to the 2 points that underlie what you say? Firstly, income tax, and secondly, for I think it would be fair of you to raise this question, value-added tax as well. On the question of direct taxes, if one looks at direct taxes, suppose we had just validated the tax system we inherited, that is to say, increased it in line with inflation year after year. If we had done that, at every level of income, taxes would be sharply higher under that tax system that we inherited than it is now. People have a good deal less, a good deal more net disposable income at all levels of income now. On value-added tax, we have switched some tax from income tax to expenditure taxes, to value-added tax. That doesn't impact particularly disproportionately on people with modest incomes for this reason. There are a number of areas of value-added tax. Food, I suppose, is the most important and obvious example. Fuel, I suppose, is a second important one. Children's clothes and shoes is a third important one, that form a large part of the expenditure pattern of people on modest incomes, and of course they are free of value-added tax. The other point I'd make, if I might just add this point, what I seek to do in the next 5 years is to bring the basic rate of tax down to 20 pence. And the way we have now opened up to do it is by establishing a 20 pence tax band and widening it. That has two advantages. It means you can direct your tax cuts first at the people with least income. And secondly, it means you can make tax cuts at a cost of less than a penny a time. A penny a time is expensive. Less than a penny of time is possible.
Mr. Bull?
That's very fine. That's very fine. Sounds lovely. But it does nothing at all for the people who are not even entitled to pay tax, the really poorest. I mean, let's face it, when you were handing out these tax bonanzas to the rich, Norman Tebbit was telling people to get on their bikes if they wanted a job. And then you took from the youngest who were going out to find a job, even sufficient to buy a puncture outfit.
Well, let me try and respond directly to those 2 points, if I may, Mr. Bull. Firstly, as far as the poorest are concerned, those who don't pay tax. There are a lot of people, of course, who don't pay tax. There are rather more people who don't pay tax now than there were in 1979, and for this reason, we have raised by about a quarter, I think the figure's 23% from memory, the thresholds at which people begin to pay tax. So fewer people pay tax because we have lifted the level at which they start paying tax. The second point about the people on very modest incomes is, I think, the one I was addressing just a moment ago with the 20 pence band. You see, in addition to the rate of income tax people pay, they also have deducted from their net income their national insurance contributions, unless their incomes are very low indeed. There is a threshold below which they don't pay that. But once they pass that, people on modest incomes pay another 9% as well. So for those on 25 pence, it is in fact 34 pence in the pound deducted over a third of their income. Now my judgment is that that is too much, which is why I want to concentrate on getting from the bottom upwards, tax cuts from the bottom upwards, more and more people into the 20 pence band to minimise the tax that people on modest incomes pay.
Mr. Major, the underlying point that our caller has twice stated was that you claim classlessness as your aspiration, but the gap between those at the bottom and those at the top, and the statistics indeed endorse this fact, has increased.
Yes, well, let me come, I'll respond happily directly to that point. At all levels of income, both for those who are relatively poor and those who are very well off, there has been a net increase in disposable income. Right down the bottom, it's about 10%, I take the figures from memory. I think that is the important prospect. I'm not sure that you actually help people at the bottom by being disproportionately punitive to people at the top. Because if you sliced off all the top incomes of everybody who earned over £50,000 and redistributed it, it would make but the most marginal difference. I think Mr. Smith's mock budget illustrates that. For 9 million people, it's a net increase of twopence a week.
Let's go back for one more word, Mr. Bull.
But Mr. Major, the point is that when we were having a boom in the mid-80s, nobody heard these rich people squeaking at 60% top rate of tax. But on the other hand, I as a pensioner am told by the DFS that the law requires that I receive somewhere just under £60 a week as a pension. A person that's unemployed doesn't get that. The law says I need that to live on, but a person who's unemployed only gets £39. How come that he's differentiated against that? It always seems to me that the Tory party have looked upon the unemployed as deservedly of punishment. That it's their fault they're unemployed.
No, I must ask you to accept, Mr. Bull, that is not how I look upon them, and it's not how the Conservative Party look upon them. I want to attack the problem of unemployment and end it. But what I don't want to do is just artificially cause economic difficulties by expenditure on jobs that can't be sustained. The only way really to remove the curse of unemployment is to have the right sort of structure so that people will invest, they will feel confident to invest, and they will create jobs for people who are doing something that needs to be done, making goods that need to be sold. That can only be done with the right economic structure, low inflation, a low tax structure on companies, encouragement for other countries to invest in this country, and those sort of economic policies. It isn't easy. I promise you, if I could wave a magic wand and suddenly remove unemployment, then I would do it. But there is no magic wand. What there is a series of difficult decisions that need to be taken to get the country in a position to invest and create jobs. Mr. Bull, and I want to do that as much as you wish to see me do it.
Mr. Bull, thank you very much. And now David Pender, who rings from Bexhill in East Sussex. Your election call, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Major.
Good morning.
I would like to know why I should vote Tory. I've been a Tory for many years, when you wiped out my personal fortune with your policies.
Can you just hold on a second? Can you describe in what sense you mean your personal fortune is wiped out? Is it something you won on the pools or a business or what?
Yes, my company's been wiped out.
Well, I don't know the individual details of your company. We have had a difficult recession over the past 2 years, not just in this country, but internationally. As Mr. Shah made the point earlier, neither the credit nor the blame for things entirely rest domestically because of the international aspect of what happens. We have had a recession, and a difficult recession. We've had one here. We've seen one in other countries too, even as we speak today. The German economy, perhaps the mightiest economy we have seen in Western Europe, certainly since the Second World War, has now been in recession for several quarters and shows signs of staying in recession. The French economy is slowing down. Elsewhere in the world, that has happened in the United States, so I think there are signs they're now coming out of it now. And there are increasing signs that the Japanese economy is slowing. So it isn't just a domestic problem, it is an international problem. And the root cause, I believe, of the difficulties that there have been goes back to the stock exchange. There are many causes, it's not just one thing, but the root cause of it, the central cause of it, is the great stock exchange crash we had in November of 1987. And everybody at that time thought the same thing would happen that has happened after every similar stock exchange crash, namely that there would be a slump around the whole of the world. That was our view as the government, it was the opposition's view, it was business's view. And we accepted the judgment, we made the judgment and everybody else did, that we should bring interest rates down very rapidly. In retrospect, but only in retrospect, it can now be seen, couldn't be seen at the time, that that was the wrong judgment.
Mr. Pender?
And when the economy grew and interest rates came up, people, of course, were caught in the middle. That's effectively what happened.
You are an unfortunate consequence of an avowedly wrong judgment, but that shouldn't stop you voting Tory.
Well, no. I hadn't come to the second point. I will if you wish me to.
Let him come back in, and then you come back in after him. Mr. Pender?
No, I think Mr. Major knows the root cause of the recession, and that was too high interest rates too long. And it brought every company to its knees, and it put everybody, the mortgages they couldn't meet, and that's the root cause of this recession. And Mr. Major was the Chancellor when this happened, and it was his policy to keep the interest rates high when he was advised to bring them down. We know.
Okay.
Mr. Pender is quite right that I kept interest rates at 15% during the period I was Chancellor. Let me explain to Mr. Pender and to everybody else why I did it. What is the single thing that could prolong a recession and make our problems infinitely worse than they have been? And we have seen it in the past. The thing that could most do that is inflation. The one thing that all businesses, particularly Mr. Pender's small businesses, need is a stable economic environment and low inflation. When I became Chancellor, inflation was 10.9%. And a lot of people were saying to me, well, it's going up. It's going to go up way beyond 10.9% to 15 and beyond. And I have always said, I said on the first day I became Chancellor and have always maintained that the primary thing we have to do is to get inflation down for two reasons. One, the business reason, but also the social reason. Inflation does wreck people's savings. It's disproportionately punitive on people on low incomes and fixed incomes. And frankly, I must tell you, I loathe inflation, and I want to get it down. And the way of getting it down was to have interest rates that would force inflation down. I know of no other way that credibly would have done it. And that has worked. Inflation was 10.9. It's now 4.1, and it's falling. And the input levels of inflation, the production costs, the producer prices, they're now between 0 and 2%. And what we are now heading for, and I know the difficulties that you and others have faced, but what we are now heading for is a lower level of inflation consistently than we have seen for many years, and we are now in pursuit of stable prices, something we haven't seen in my adult lifetime, and something that would be a great prize for this country, for individuals, for businesses, for investment, for jobs, and for prosperity. It couldn't have been done without pursuing that interest rate policy, though I was never in any doubt that it was going to be difficult.
A reluctant torturer you were. If it wasn't hurting, it wasn't working.
Well, it wasn't a question of torture. It was a question of actually lancing the boil, if I might put it that way.
That's another way of putting it. Mr. Pender, last word to you, briefly.
No, I don't. I'm sorry, Mr. Major. You might fool some of the people, but you won't fool me.
Okay.
You doubled the VAT. You doubled the interest rates. You doubled the business rates. All forms of taxation to the small business and the man in the street.
Oh, no, that's not true.
It is true. It is true, and that's what you've done.
No, Mr. Pender, the rates of taxation, corporation tax on small business, we introduced some time ago a special low rate of corporation tax for small businesses. It's tied to the basic rate of income tax. It's now down to 25%. Taxation on small businesses was much higher in recent years and infinitely higher under the Labour government. And so were many of the other ancillary benefits that small businesses get. I know they've had difficulties, but upon that point, you are clearly factually wrong.
Mr. Pender, I must move on. Thank you for your call. Garnet Marshall now from Birmingham.
Good morning, Mr. Major.
Good morning, Mr. Marshall.
I'll be voting Conservative tomorrow. I was born and brought up in the constituency of Isloin in Gwent, but I neither share the values of socialism or subscribe to them. However, there's a particular aspect of your future tax plans that you've made personally that I believe probably gives rise to the worries that people have over your handling of the health service and education, especially to people like me. I actually don't want to pay any more tax, but I don't want to pay any less either. And what I would have liked to have seen is a firmer commitment from you to say that tax will be held at the 25p rate, and any growth in the economy will be directed towards things like the health service and education.
Prime Minister.
Well, I understand that point. Let me tell you how I see the national dividend being divided. I think we have made the reductions in top rate tax that are necessary, and I made it clear earlier in the campaign that I don't see any further changes in the top rate of tax, and I'm certainly not promising any. I do want to minimise tax at the lower end, and let me tell you the people who principally gained and indicate, because this is the point that underlies your question, the priority between tax and public expenditure. I perhaps can best do it by a practical example. In his budget a month or so ago, Norman Lamont introduced this new 20p tax band, and a large number of people moved wholly from paying 25% tax to 20p tax. Now, who are these people who gain from this? There really are four groups, I think, particularly who gained. Firstly, men and women who have very low-paid jobs, they gain. Secondly, many married women who work part-time would gain. Thirdly, young people starting out on their careers and still having only a modest income, they would move into the 20p tax band. And fourthly, people who are disabled, who sadly often command only very low incomes, they too would gain. And I think if one said to the country, do you think it is right that those four groups should pay a smaller level of tax? I think most people would agree with that. The total cost of Norman Lamont's tax reductions was £1.8 billion, 1.8 billion. The total increase in public expenditure was many times that amount in the public expenditure round. Indeed, there was a greater level of increase in the National Health Service alone than there was in tax cuts across the board for everyone.
Okay.
Now, for the future, if I may just add the future point. For the future, that is rather how I see us proceeding. We have set out our public expenditure plans. Nobody should be in any doubt that I am determined to see that we continue to provide resourcing over and above inflation for the National Health Service.
Okay,
I've set out education and health.
Let's go back
we'll cut tax where we can, but the expenditure areas that I've set out are priorities as well.
Mr. Marshall?
Yeah, I hear what you say, Mr. Major. The Labour Party, for instance, said that they would put up taxes. The Liberals said that they would put up taxes.
But let's just come to your first point that you made to John Major. He's given you an explanation of why you can have both and should have both. You said you wanted it all on public expenditure in future. Do you now take his argument, or are you still unhappy?
Well, I'm still unhappy because, in a sense, I believe I'm probably speaking for people like myself, sort of 40-ish, if you like, who've done quite well over the last decade. And who feel that, you know, by my own fruition, if you like, I will probably continue to do well, and I don't need...
Lots of people make the same point. Why not commit it all to public expenditure, given that there's only precious little to play with in any case?
Well, I think Mr. Marshall made the point himself, and quite fairly. He's 40, and he thinks he's not in too bad a condition. The 4 sets of people that I set out, may be any age, of course, but they aren't necessarily in a particularly favourable condition. They do, by definition, have relatively modest incomes. And they don't only lose, of course, their 20p tax, they lose an extra 9% above a certain threshold in national insurance contributions as well. That's what I see as the really attractive part of this. Tax cuts from the bottom upwards, as we can afford it, helping disproportionately the people on the least incomes, so they can make choices for themselves and their families, rather than have them made for them by the government, who take their money and make their choice on their behalf for them.
Mr. Marshall, thank you very much. And now we go to Leonard Mora, who rings from Swindon in Wiltshire. Your election call to Mr. Major.
Good morning, Mr. Major.
Good morning, Mr. Mora.
Mr. Major, in the 1980s, the Tory government under Mrs. Thatcher moved considerably to the right and allowed itself to be influenced by previously unacceptable right-wing ideological think tanks, particularly in its attitude to the welfare state. Now, you appeared to have brought the party somewhat back to the centre, but many people suspect that if you were returned with an unassailable majority, your policies in this area would return to the right. And my question to you is, to what extent will you distance yourself from the extreme right-wing philosophy of Mrs. Thatcher?
Well, I'm not sure that I accept the underlying premise, if I may say so, Mr. Mora, because throughout the 1980s, despite often the perception and despite often the oratory that people use about Mrs. Thatcher, huge extra resources were committed to many of the social services and particularly to the health service. But as far as my own position for the future is concerned, if I may put it this way, what you see is what you get. I have tried to set out for people in unvarnished terms the priorities that I see and what I wish to see. And I have made no secret of the fact that I'm a huge supporter, for example, of the National Health Service. Our opponents frequently say that we would privatise the National Health Service. I can look you straight in the eye and say I won't. There is no way in which I would privatise the National Health Service. As I said the other evening, I am no more likely to privatise the National Health Service than I am to join the Labour Party.
If you wanted to help the caller and others, how would you most unambiguously distinguish yourself from Margaret Thatcher?
Well, we're operating in a different environment. The position that Mrs. Thatcher inherited when she became Prime Minister was very different from the position that I have inherited. She had a whole series of acute difficulties that have largely been solved during the years of the 80s. She had terrible difficulties. In 1979, there was a great worry in many people's minds about whether any trades unions would let the government govern.
But if she hadn't been moved from power and you had reached this point, is what the caller's really talking about, at this point.
Yes, of course. But Mrs. Thatcher was moving to that evolving position as well. Politicians, and governments perhaps even more than opposition politicians, react to what the realities of the world are and what in practice needs to be done. Now, what in practice needs to be done is different in the 1990s from that needed to be done in the 1980s because circumstances have changed.
Let's go back to Mr. Mora then.
Well, I think Mrs. Thatcher was a great admirer of Reaganism and American republicanism, which seems very extremely to the right. And I think what Thatcherism has done in this country is to make respectable, in a way that no previous Conservative administration did, the ideology of self-interest. And I feel this very strongly. I just hope that Mr. Major is in fact distancing himself from this position.
Are you ideologically at one with Margaret Thatcher, John Major?
I don't think that most people who know me would regard me particularly as an ideologue in any way. I do very much agree with Mrs. Thatcher about choice and about independence.
And where do you disagree with her?
Well, I'll come on to the points that I agree with, if I may. I also think it is very important that governments collectively and people individually should accept a degree of responsibility for those people who, for one reason or another, are unable to enjoy the same quality of life that the rest of us do. That is a traditional Tory doctrine. It's one I care about very much, and it is one the Tory party subscribes to.
So no disagreements with Margaret Thatcher at all, apart from the poll tax?
I was, well, we've been through the community charge on a number of occasions, and we may yet go through it again. I am a very great admirer of Mrs. Thatcher, and I'm not, in retrospect, going to criticise what she did. I sat in her government, I was an admirer of what she did, I believe history will treat very kindly the tremendous contribution she made to the quality of life in Britain and to the standing of Britain abroad.
Are you saying I go into this election tomorrow wearing the mantle of Margaret Thatcher?
No, I go into this election wearing the mantle of John Major with the policies that I have set out, but I go into it also as an unqualified admirer of what Margaret Thatcher achieved.
Thank you for raising that question, Leonard Mora. Ronald Spall now from Reading.
If you do not intend to privatise the National Health Service, why is it that now I have no access to National Health Service dental treatment?
I don't intend to privatise the National Health Service, Mr. Spall. The National Health Service Trust hospitals remain National Health Service hospitals. GPs who have become fund holders remain fund holders within the National Health Service, and there are National Health Service dentists all around the country. Some dentists in the National Health Service, self-employed dentists, have decided to take private care, but I am determined to make sure that there are National Health Service dentists across the country.
Mr. Spall?
I only go to the dentist once every 18 months now because I can no longer afford to go.
Well, I think your dentist would say that perhaps you should give a greater priority at 6 months, and I hope you will. But I hope very much that you will find that you don't have any difficulties with this. You shouldn't have. Some dentists I know have decided to treat private patients, and they have decided that they will become self-employed and operate outside the National Health Service.
Do you have plans to restore free dental treatment, is underlying his question?
No, I don't have plans to restore free dental treatment. And that
or check-ups?
That isn't a privatisation point. The first government to actually introduce charges was the Labour government in 1951. And they reintroduced them again, I think from memory, in 1968. They abolished them and reintroduced them. And those charges, of course, make a great difference to the sum total of money that's actually available in the National Health Service. That's one of the problems of reducing charges from people who can pay. And one can always argue about whether the level is right. That's a perfectly legitimate argument. But the principle of charging brings in extra money to help fund more medical health care. And I think that is right. But I have no proposals, in case anybody should misjudge the point, no proposals to extend the areas in which charges are at present levied.
Mr. Spall, is it...
I'm not impressed, obviously, because it's affected me directly, hasn't it? I'm not impressed.
Well, I can only say to you, Mr. Small, what I said to you a few moments ago. The National Health Service, in almost all its aspects, has grown and spread its wings. The number of treatments these days that are available on the National Health Service, both in the quantity of treatments, the nature of treatments, and the quality of treatments, has improved. Robin Cook set a test for the trust hospitals, but it's a good test for the whole of the health service. Are more people being treated? And as inpatients and outpatients in total, around 3 million more people are being treated and well treated by the National Health Service every year. Now that is a remarkable tribute, firstly to the health service, but it couldn't have been done without the extra doctors, the extra nurses, the extra medical staff and the extra dentists that actually have been made available in the health service as a result of the increased funding the government has provided.
Thank you for your call, Mr. Spall. And now John Roper, who rings from Stroud in Gloucestershire.
Prime Minister, your vision of Britain is empowering the people, not overpowering them. One result of the poll tax is that my wife and I, having paid our bill, are being summoned before magistrates to recover £14.52, which we withheld in protest at having to pay the debts of tax dodgers. We are two of 500 people around here being summoned by Stroud Council for not paying the surcharge or part of it. Is that not overpowering honest people and ignoring lawbreakers?
Well, I don't believe it is. Let me firstly say I have a great deal of sympathy with the frustration that people feel about the surcharge on their community charge bills that are paid because other people have not paid their bills. And I regret very much that a number of prominent politicians, not in my party, actually encourage people not to pay their community charge bills, ensuring that the charge was levied on other people. But the local authorities have set their services and they have sent out bills to raise the income to sustain those services. They have a duty to do that, and the law requires them to sustain their services and to set out their bills. What I hope and expect will be the position, despite the frustration I know you feel, and I would feel the same frustration upon that point, despite that, we have said to the local authorities they must pursue the non-payers and they must obtain the money from the non-payers. As they do that and it comes in, it will of course affect the level of charge next year, and the surcharge that you get next year ought to result in a lesser charge than would otherwise be the case next year.
Mr.
But
Roper?
I do understand your frustration, and I don't dismiss it, but they have no choice.
In the meantime, we are paying. The councils will recover through the courts, presumably. Therefore, they will have got the money twice. Shall we get a rebate?
Well, they will charge the net amount they need to charge to sustain their services. But I think you made the point yourself a few moments ago that people have to obey the law, all of them, despite frustration from time to time. And the law does require people to pay the community charge that is lawfully laid upon them by local authorities. I share your frustration. I'm very angry indeed about the way some people advise the public not to pay the community charge, with the effects that you now face. But I think the local authorities have had to act as they did, and as they collect in the arrears, it will diminish the charge that you will be required to pay, under the council tax it will be, next year and in future years.
Mr. Roper, thank you for your call. Hazel Light from Flamlingham in Suffolk.
Mr. Major, it appears that you would like a classless society. Now, what about the problem of schools? If schools opt out, does that mean we'll go back to the old two-tier system? Because, for obvious reasons, the schools with good reputations will want to take the children of good academic ability. Where will that leave the children of less ability? Are we going back to having a secondary system and a grammar school system? And could we finish up like the dentist, limited in choice?
Well, no, exactly not. If I can take the choice point first, it's precisely because we are concerned to widen choice that we're pursuing some of the policies we are. We want parents to have several things: more choice and a good deal more information about the schools their children go to, and a good deal more control over what actually happens in those schools. We would favour there being a very wide choice in state education. The mainstream comprehensive system will be the primary choice, of course, and that is where most people will go. In addition to that, we see a place for city technology colleges that will particularly specialise in technology. We see a place for technology-based comprehensives that will have a bias towards technology. We see a place for a small number of grammar schools where that is the demand of parents and local people. And we also see a place for grant-maintained schools, the schools you referred to as opt-out. Let me just make the point so that nobody misunderstands it. They are not opting out of the state system. They merely are no longer under the direct funding control of the local education authority. The money comes directly to the local school, and the decisions are taken not by the education authority, but by the headmaster and by the governors, many of whom would be parents. Now, the headmasters of the grant-maintained schools would say that it has given them, the headmasters, and the parents, a much greater control of what goes on in the school and much greater choice. The other point, if I may just add it, Jonathan, very briefly, is the extra information that I believe parents should have about their children at school. I think they should have, as a matter of right, a report each year on their child's performance at school. Not invariably the case now. They should be told about examination results internally and across the school as a whole. They should be given comparative examination results between their school and other schools. And when the school has an independent inspection by people examining how the school does and comparing it with others, that inspection report should be available to parents. All that gives more information to parents, enables them to play a larger part in the school, and will, we believe, help to force up the quality of education in our schools, and that is our aim.
Hazel Light, has that answered your question?
Well, yes, I'm in agreement with the more information, but it still worries me that schools will become elitist, because naturally they will want to attract the children of better ability, so their results are better. Are you going to guarantee that if we live in a catchment area, for instance, we move to this part of the world because the school that my children have the opportunity to go to has a very good academic rate and also a very good pastoral care system. Now, are you going to guarantee that if we live in a catchment area for future children, this won't apply to my children, but for children coming up in the system, are they going to be guaranteed a place in the catchment area they live in?
I think overwhelmingly children will go into the catchment area they live in. There will be the possibility of cross-referrals. There is now. There is a degree of choice where, for one reason or another, parents want their children to go to a school perhaps an elder child went to. There is some cross-fertilisation of schools in that sense at the moment. But overwhelmingly, of course, I think people will remain in the catchment area. What we're seeking to do is to level up the standards of education, not level down. There is an instinctive competition amongst children, in my judgment. They do like to see things that are challenging being set for them. Put a number of youngsters together, for example, with a football or a cricket ball or a netball, and they'll compete. That is a natural instinct amongst young people. Now, what I want to do is to see us harness that competition, that desire for competition, and try and level up the quality of education, not level it down, because we will need, firstly, I believe we owe it to children to give them that sort of opportunity and that sort of education. And secondly, on a wider canvas, we actually need the best talent that we can get coming through our schools, and that means that they need the best sort of education and levelling up. And it is for that reason that in one of my first speeches as Prime Minister, I made it clear that education was going to be at the top of my priorities for the 1990s.
Prime Minister, if grant-maintained schools opt in growing numbers to become grammar schools, and Ken Clarke has said if they want to, he's not overwhelmingly going to stand in their way, and those grammar schools are free to select their pupils, how do you preserve a non-two-tier system?
There will be some schools that will wish to become grammar schools, and where there's an overwhelming local case and an overwhelming local demand, some extra schools may well become grammar schools. But there is no question of breaking down the mainstream comprehensive system. It will be a minority of grammar schools in order to preserve that diversity and choice.
You will legislate or preserve that by fiat from the top?
Well, it would depend what the demand would be, frankly. But at the moment, the demand looks as though it is going to be there, but modest, and that demand is dependent upon the authority of the Secretary of State approving it.
But if that demand is met, well, those grammar schools are then opting to choose who they take.
But that is a hypothesis that isn't taking place. At the moment, there is modest demand, and where appropriate, that modest demand is met. Not invariably does the Secretary of State grant that demand.
Thank you. And now Tom Wakeford from Lancaster.
I am a first-time voter, and I'm studying at university. Can you explain how you can claim to want to expand higher education while your policies at the same time are driving many students into debt?
Well, let me illustrate it in the most vivid way possible, Mr. Wakeford. In 1979, 1 in 8 of our young people actually went into higher education. Today, it is 1 in 4 of our young people who go into higher education, and the projections for the future accepted by us and accepted by the education profession is that it will be 1 in 3. So we are expanding the number of young people going into higher education and improving their qualifications. I'm sure that's the right thing to do, both in terms of giving them direct qualifications and also giving them a much wider background opportunity to study generally before they go out into the wider world of work. So I think that is a clear-cut response.
Mr. Wakeford?
Well, two answers to that. Firstly, the only reason you can say you've put more people into higher education is that you've changed the name of higher education colleges and techs into polytechnics. Well, it's happening all over the country. And secondly, it doesn't matter how many people you claim are in higher education. This week, a report said that 80% of students, even applying for your student loans, were already in debt. But more importantly than just figures that we could band about forever, let me give you one specific example of student poverty. I've got a friend who was a second-year economics student. Her family's not very well off. One of her parents is unemployed. She took a student loan, but still she was short of money. She had so little money she couldn't really eat properly, and her doctor diagnosed her as having malnutrition. She became too ill to complete her course. Now, this isn't an isolated incident, and I think your classless society is just a sham. Your policies are leading to a privatised higher education system, and just like you talked about the children with the competing for the cricket bat, this is the result of your fetish with competition.
OK, now let the Prime Minister come back in to answer broadly the thrust of those charges.
Well, there are 4 points. I'll answer all 4 if you...
Sure.
If you will permit me to do so. On the question of figures, I just have to say bluntly to you, you are wrong about the figures. There are more people going into higher education. You raised the question of the classless society. What I have actually done with higher education is to try and abolish that artificial distinction between people who go to polytechnics and people who go to universities. They've always both been higher education. Why on earth should not people who go to good polytechnics have the right to accept the same sort of qualifications and let them have the same status they would have as universities? They should have. That is the classless society at work. It has been a huge success for the polytechnics. We have done it. We're going to go on doing it. And it doesn't make any difference to the figures I quoted about higher education. They remain right. There has been a huge expansion in the number of our young people going into higher education. On the question of the level of student grants and loans, whatever you may say about the level here, and we will keep them under review. I don't wish to see students facing undue difficulties. We will keep them under review. But whatever you may care to say about them, the level of student loans and grants that we have in this country is as high, or almost as high, as any comparable country in the world. And in a number of countries in the world, there are no grants. There are just loans. And students, as a matter of course, borrow their money while they go through higher education with the intention of repaying it with the higher incomes they should earn through the whole of their lifetime of work as a result of that education. Now, I don't agree with that. I think it should be predominantly granted. It is. But we have top-up loans as well, and that top-up loan system is working very satisfactorily. You referred to privatisation. There is no privatisation of higher education, and I don't think you can point to any. It is a state education system. It is going to remain a state education system.
Thank you. Mr. Wakeford, just you made a lot of points and the Prime Minister's answered them. Just on the one case which may reside in viewers' minds, the case of this particular student, you claim that it's widespread that people get into this kind of predicament. Are you really asserting that that isn't just a very unfortunate case?
Well, the figures speak for themselves. 80% of people applying for the Conservative government's student loans are already in poverty. Okay, now, if the Prime Minister is telling me that in all comparable countries 80% of students are in debt, then I just don't believe it. It's becoming a third world higher education system.
Just on that point.
Well, I think it's ludicrous, with great respect. I don't wish to banter too much upon that point, but I frankly don't agree with it. In other countries there are just loans, so by definition people do borrow to go through higher education. If some students are running into trouble, well, let us know about it, and we'll keep the level of grants and loans under review to make sure it doesn't happen. But they are at a reasonable level at the moment, and we will attempt to keep them at a reasonable level. And if it were as difficult as Mr. Wakeford says, it does seem a surprising thing to me that such an increasing number of young men and women are going through university. And the other point I haven't touched upon is that as a result of our new system, there is a smaller burden on parents with the parental contribution, which no longer has been soaring as once it did under the old system.
Thank you, Mr. Wakeford. And now Tony Halmos from London.
Yes, Mr. Major, could you tell us what you and the Conservatives will do in the event of a hung Parliament, which looks likely, with Labour as the largest party, so not yourselves but Labour, and Labour forming the government, and the vote comes up on the Queen's speech, presumably on May the 11th, just after the speech on the 6th of May, would you do what the Conservatives did in February 1974 and abstain, and so support a Labour government continuing in office, unfettered by any constraints?
Well, I have to say to you, Mr. Halmos, and you won't be surprised to hear me saying it, that I do not remotely believe that is going to be the outcome of this election. And I think everything you ask me thereafter is a matter purely of hypothesis. But purely also, in order to respond to that hypothesis, I would study what was in the programme and what I thought was in the interest of the country. But I think it is so far off the beam of what is going to happen that I really wouldn't wish to say any more about it.
Mr. Halmos?
Well, firstly, it's not off the beam, since all but half a dozen opinion polls of this election, and there have been 50, 60 of them, say that that's the likely result. Secondly, if you won't answer specifically, we must be left with the prospect that you will do what you did in February 1974. We've got to make the assumption when we vote tomorrow that the Conservatives may well support Labour continuing in office, which then rather demolishes all your arguments of the last 4 weeks that Labour will be absolutely dreadful and that they ruin the country. And I think you said last night...
I think they would. I think they would. I'm happy to respond to those points. I think they would be absolutely dreadful. If you're coming out of a recession as we are, what would be absolutely stark staring bonkers, to borrow a phrase from Quintin Hogg in years gone past? What would be stark staring bonkers would be to increase taxes on an economy coming out of recession, as even Mr. Smith's phony budget does, quite apart from the tax increases they'd need for the rest of their programme, and then to increase costs on employers, the minimum wage, for example, the social contract from Europe, for example, and a whole series of other areas that would actually encourage people not to invest. Now, you mentioned opinion polls. Well, let me deal with a different sort of opinion poll, the attitude surveys of business. 90-odd% of businessmen say, looking at the policies of the two parties, that the Conservatives will bring us out of recession and Labour will not. And a large percentage of those businessmen, something over a quarter, between a quarter and a third in different polls, say they will actually cut their investment plans if there were to be a Labour government.
But Prime Minister, what about caller?
So there would be huge difficulties about that.
Let's go back to the point that the caller was making, Prime Minister. He's done a good journalistic job, and he's saying, in addition, because he's a voter and cares about it, that he's worried that if you do abstain, you will produce a situation in which you get a Labour government. He wants you to rule out abstaining on the Queen's speech, but you're not going to do that.
I don't know what they're going to put in the Queen's speech. But if they put in the Queen's speech the policies that they have at present outlined, we would certainly vote against that. But I don't know what they would do in these hypothetical circumstances. And in any event, I'm not going to get sucked into the question of these hypothetical circumstances, because what I see on the doorstep, what I hear from my candidates up and down the country, what I hear from our party machine up and down the country is that that is not going to be the result on Thursday. We are going to win the election on Thursday, and I believe we are going to win it with a clear majority for 5 years. The rest, as they say, is a pure hypothesis, and on Friday morning, of course, we will know.
Mr. Halmos, thank you very much, and I have to say, Prime Minister, that with great skill he did suck you in a little bit into the prospects of a hung Parliament, didn't he? And you said
I think, Jonathan, he's done better than most have done in this election,
a lot better
and he
than
may
us.
even be after your job.
I think he should deserve it, absolutely unequivocally. But what, just for the record, and people will notice, you said that you would study, if under these circumstances, you would study what was in the Queen's speech and decide what was in the national interest before determining whether you would abstain or vote against it.
I also said if they put forward the policies they have, that we would vote against it.
All the policies they have, but if they left a few out, it was conceivable that you might abstain.
I think it's most unlikely we'll be in the circumstances, and most unlikely that they could possibly leave them out.
Interesting point, Mr. Halmos. Thank you very much. And now Ingrid Bell from Aberdeen. Your election call to John Major.
Hello, Mr. Major.
Good morning.
How do you account for the intense hostility to Tories as a species in Scotland?
It's very curious, isn't it? If one looks at what has happened in Scotland over the last 12 years in terms of the improving quality of life and the improving investment, then there has been a very dramatic improvement right the way across Scotland. I think probably it is not specifically a feeling necessarily about the Conservative Party, but about the fact that Westminster seems a long way away from Scotland and one party has been in government for a long time. I cannot prove it, but I strongly suspect that there would be a similar strength of feeling if there had been a non-Conservative government in Westminster for a very long period of time. What I'm concerned about in Scotland is that we continue to pursue policies that enable Scotland to grow. And I'm very worried that some of the policies by all of our opponents, the Labour Party, the Liberal Party, and of course in Scotland the SNP, would damage Scotland's interest, Scotland's self-interest, and Scotland's future prosperity. That does worry me very much, quite apart from the difficulties I think those policies would have for the rest of the United Kingdom.
Yes, but you haven't managed to convince people in Scotland of that, have you?
Well, we'll see on Thursday about that.
Well, I think that the polls show pretty fundamentally that people in Scotland are opposed to the Conservative Party and their policies.
OK, Ingrid Bell, you've made your point, and the Prime Minister said we'll wait till Thursday. I want to move on because we've got some more calls coming through. Thank you for that. David Cook now from Peterborough.
Good morning, Prime Minister.
Peterborough's doing well this morning. Good morning, Mr. Cook.
Sorry, ex-Prime Minister, I should have said. Yeah, my question is, with our manufacturing base now virtually destroyed, and we seem to be importing more than we can possibly export because we don't produce, with your attitude of not going along more easily with a European common currency, are we not in danger that the financial impact that we do have in the world will move onto the continent?
Well, I find it very curious that you say that about the manufacturing industry. It is, of course, the line the Labour Party run. They're forever running manufacturing industry down. But if manufacturing industry is doing badly, why are our exports going up? What are we exporting if it isn't manufacturing? Our exports have gone up month after month after month after month. They went up by another 700 million or so in the last month's figures. We have a rising share of world trade. We have exports running at record levels. I was out and about yesterday looking at a part of the machine tool industry that people say no longer exist. They say they're undercutting Japan by 300%. They've doubled their output in each of the last 4 years. Look at the motor car industry. That's a pretty big manufacturer. It's doing better than it did for many years. I remember the days of Red Robbo and British Leyland falling through the floor with your taxpayers' money supporting it, Mr. Cook.
But hasn't manufacturing up just on the motor car point?
I'll come directly to the motor car point and productivity
generally.
I'll come directly to that point. I was just about to do so. Manufacturing productivity throughout the 1980s has risen. Our share of manufacturing world trade has risen. And the projections for the motor industry is that we will be a net exporter of cars in the mid-1990s. And the chairman of the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders has written to the Chancellor of the Exchequer within the last few days saying he expects the demand for cars to increase. And the motor industry is going to be one of the great successes of the 1990s.
You could hardly get down much further demand for cars, could it, Prime Minister?
It is an absolute... Well, it's a... Well,
but who makes the cars?
Can I respond to Jonathan first, Mr. Cook, and then I'll come back to you. If one looks at the projections of what is going to happen to the motor car industry, it was flat on its back in the 1970s, up to its ears with taxpayers' subsidy. That is no longer the case. It is a growing industry with fresh investment and increasingly an exporter. I'm sorry, Mr. Cook, you wanted to come back.
Yeah, I was just going to say, who actually makes the cars? Where is a British-owned and controlled car company left in Britain.
You could make the same point about any other country in the world. The motor car industry is so international now. Many foreign cars have British engines and British components. All cars are polyglots to an extent these days, but the investment is in this country, the manufacturing is in this country, the export is from this country, the profits come to this country, and the tax shield comes to this government for your services.
Mr. Cook, thank you so much. And now Mary Hudson, who rings from Welling in Kent.
Hello, Mr. Major.
Good morning.
I'd like to just make the point. My son, he's 34, and for the past 10 years, he's been made redundant 4 times. He's unemployed at the moment and has been for nearly 2 years. Now, there is just one point I would like to make. He was very upset when he heard Mr. Lamont say that being unemployed is a price worth paying. And I'd like to know how you felt about it.
That one phrase, how do you feel about that? It's not the economic argument, it's the phrase used.
Yeah. No, I understand that, and so, if I may say so, does the Chancellor. It was a phrase wrenched out in a parliamentary debate that sounded harsh and wasn't intended to be so. The point that Norman Lamont was seeking to make was that the only way we get people back permanently into jobs is to get low inflation, and it isn't easy to get low inflation. That was the point he was seeking to make. He would have phrased it differently if he did it again, but in the heat and fire of a parliamentary debate, no one always expresses things in the way, in retrospect, they would most have liked to.
Mary Hudson, thank you very much. And swiftly now to Jonathan Ross from London. A Jonathan Ross from London.
Not the Jonathan Ross.
I don't know. We'll find out. Mr. Ross.
Hello.
Good morning, Mr. Ross.
He regards himself as the Jonathan Ross, don't you, Jonathan?
I am the Jonathan Ross.
Absolutely. Get on with the question.
I'm sure you're right to be so.
Mr. Major, what mistakes would you say you have made as Prime Minister?
I think the politician who didn't make mistakes has never been in government, and the man in government who admits to his mistakes is not a politician. I'm more concerned with what we're setting out for the future. I see no point in traipsing over that old ground.
So you're not prepared to admit to your mistakes?
Well, I've set out the mistakes that I thought collectively we made after the 1987 stock exchange crash. I've never made any secret of that.
Do you, Mr. Ross, do you detect since John Major has been Prime Minister any mistakes that he might have made that you would like him to acknowledge or not?
Mistakes, yes. Namely, in the timing of the election, perhaps. It may prove to be a costly mistake.
No, I don't believe so. I think the timing of the election was right for the country, Mr. Ross. I will defend that very vigorously. There are many who say I could have called an election immediately after the Gulf War. I think that would have been wrong for 2 reasons. People had had no chance to judge me, and secondly, I had not put in place the alternative to the community charge. I wish to do that before the election.
Mr. Ross, thank you for your call. Thank you for all your calls. Prime Minister, thank you for coming in here this morning. This has been the last election call before you make your decision tomorrow. I hope that all these programmes have been helpful to you. But from John Major and from myself, thank you for watching these programmes. Good voting and good morning.
Election Call was presented by Jonathan Dimbleby and produced by Nick Utechin.
We can establish a Parliament for Wales with legislative, economic and financial powers if, and only if, the people of Wales give Plaid Cymru the level of support that makes that a practicality.
We don't believe that any sensible Scot would buy a second-hand car off Mr. Kinnock, and we don't see why he expects the Scottish people to buy a secret pig-in-the-poke assembly from him either.
We shall not forget that election night is general election night. This is a nationwide election, and the voters in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland may make different decisions from the voters in England. We shall cover the length and breadth of the kingdom. Election 92, Radio 4's results programme, will begin at 5 to 10 on Thursday evening and end at tea time on Friday.